The termination took 4 minutes. Richard Colby didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a door, didn't need to. He simply told the man who'd just warned him that the tallest building he'd ever developed could trap 400 people in a smoke-filled stairwell that night, that his services were no longer required, and asked security to walk him to his truck. Marcus Webb didn't argue. He picked up his hard hat, his laptop, and the notebook he'd carried onto every job site for 19 years, and he left the way he'd learned to leave rooms like that one. Spine straight, voice level, giving them nothing to point to later. What none of them knew, standing in that glass-walled conference room 41 floors above Nashville, was that Marcus had already filed his findings with the city that morning, hours before Colby ever called him in. It wasn't paperwork to Marcus. It was a promise he'd made at 19, at his father's funeral, in a suit borrowed because the department couldn't afford dress uniforms for men who died on double shifts. He kept that promise the way he kept every promise, quietly, on paper, in triplicate. 17 minutes after Marcus Webb walked out of the Ridgeline Tower for the last time, every alarm in the building went off at once. 6 days before that, the Ridgeline smelled like fresh concrete and glass cleaner. The particular smell of a building that has just learned how to be a building and hasn't yet been lived in. Marcus got there at 6:10 every morning, before the first crew truck, before the coffee cart set up on Demon Brayan Street, because the stairwells were quiet then, and quiet was when you could actually hear a system tell you the truth. 42 stories, $310 million, 600 condos and offices stacked over a retail podium with a lobby ceiling so tall it swallowed sound. It was the biggest project Webb Life Safety Consulting had ever touched, and Webb Life Safety Consulting was, in total, Marcus, 2 junior engineers, and a part-time bookkeeper who was also his sister-in-law. He was 41 years old. He'd been a licensed fire protection engineer for 16 of those years, and the engineer of record on the Ridgeline's life safety systems for the last 18 months, which meant his signature, not the developers, not the architects. His was the one that told the city of Nashville this building was safe to fill with human beings. The lobby security guard that morning, a young man new to the rotation, stopped him at the turnstile and asked, not unkindly, whether he was there with the flooring crew. Marcus held up his hard hat, the one stenciled engineer of record in fading letters across the brim, and said no, he was there with the building. The guard waved him through and didn't think twice about it. Marcus thought about it the rest of the elevator ride up. He always did. It wasn't the first time, and by now it barely registered as an insult so much as weather, the kind of thing you dressed for without discussing. He kept a notebook. Spiral bound, corner soft from his thumb, the initials EW. Still faintly visible on the inside cover in handwriting that wasn't his. It had been his father's before it was his. A habit, not a family heirloom, though it had become one. Elijah Webb had carried a notebook just like it into every warehouse and machine shop and mid-rise he ever walked through as a Nashville firefighter, writing down what he saw before anyone could tell him he hadn't seen it. Measure twice. Report twice. Once for the file. Once for yourself. Because the file can disappear and the truth still has to live somewhere. Elijah Webb had died 19 years ago, in a garment warehouse fire on the east side, when a sprinkler system that had been signed off as code compliant turned out not to be. The inspector who'd signed it had been paid $4,000 to look away, a fact that came out at trial 2 years later, long after it mattered to the 6 firefighters who'd gone in believing the paperwork. Marcus was 22. He switched his engineering major 11 days after the funeral, from mechanical to fire protection, and never once told anyone it was because of that number. $4,000. the price of his father's life to a man who never met him. He still drove past the old warehouse lot sometimes. It was a parking structure for a boutique hotel now, valet stand where the loading dock used to be. Nobody there knew what the ground used to be. He'd stopped there the week before the Ridgeline job started, sat in his truck for 10 minutes, and hadn't told Angela why he was late getting home. He remembered the funeral in pieces, the way you remember things from the exact age when a person is old enough to understand loss, but not yet old enough to have built any defenses against it. The borrowed suit, a size too big through the shoulders. The department's honor guard, sharp and silent, folding a flag that hadn't been earned through the military, but through something the city had decided deserved the same gesture anyway. His mother's hand gripping his so hard it left marks, though neither of them mentioned that until years later. And 2 years after that, sitting in a courtroom gallery at 19, hearing a prosecutor read out the number, $4,000, that a fire inspector had accepted to sign off on a sprinkler system nobody had actually tested. Marcus remembered how small that number sounded in a room, how it didn't match the size of what it had cost. He'd walked out of that courthouse and changed his major within the month, and he never once, in 16 years of practice, signed anything he hadn't personally verified with his own hands and his own gauge. It wasn't a policy. It was closer to a vow, the kind you don't examine too closely, because examining it might reveal how much of your whole adult life had been built around a single afternoon in a courtroom gallery. At home that week, Angela was working nights in the ER at Vanderbilt, the kind of job where she saw, on a fairly regular basis, exactly what building failures and bad decisions do to a human body up close. The Ridgeline contract, $180,000, the largest single job the firm had ever landed, was supposed to be the thing that let Marcus finally hire a fourth engineer. It was supposed to be the thing that let Jasmine Reeves, his junior engineer for the last year and a half, come on full-time instead of stretching across 3 part-time contracts to make rent on a studio apartment in East Nashville. Jasmine was 24, sharp in a way that made contractors nervous, with an engineering degree from Tennessee State and a habit of double-checking every calculation twice before she'd say a number out loud in a meeting. She'd grown up 2 neighborhoods over from where Marcus had, raised by a single mother who'd cleaned offices downtown for 20 years, without ever once getting to see the inside of one during business hours, and Jasmine had decided at 14 that she wanted to be the person whose name was actually on the buildings her mother cleaned at night. Webb Life Safety Consulting was the first firm that had ever hired her for what she could do instead of how cheap she'd work. She'd started calling the Ridgeline the one, as in, the one that was going to change things for the firm. And for her specifically. She wasn't wrong. That was what made the next 6 days so hard to watch. "You ever think about what happens if this goes sideways?" she asked Marcus one morning, watching him log stairwell pressure readings on the 31st floor landing. "Every project," he said. "That's the job. You think about what happens if it goes sideways so it doesn't. I mean with Colby. He's not exactly warm." Marcus didn't look up from the manometer. "He doesn't have to be warm. He has to be right, or I have to be able to make him right. One of those 2 things is going to happen by Saturday." A week earlier, at the city's pre-occupancy coordination meeting, Marcus had sat across a folding table from Fire Marshal Renata Ford and walked her through the Ridgeline's life safety package floor by floor. Sprinkler zoning, standpipe pressure, smoke control sequencing, while she checked his numbers against her own copy of the plans, without once asking him to slow down or explain a term. She'd worked with him on 2 prior towers. She trusted his math the way you trust a colleague's math, which is to say, she barely thought about trusting it at all. It was simply a given. the way gravity is a given. Your filings are always the cleanest ones that come through this office, Ford told him, initialing the coordination sheet. Half the engineers I deal with make me chase them for a resubmittal. You upload before I even ask. Habit, Marcus said. My father used to say the file's only worth something if it's there before somebody needs it. Smart man. Ford slid the folder back across the table. Keep doing it that way. This city's got too many buildings going up too fast for me to double-check every one of them by hand. It was a small exchange, 5 minutes, forgettable to anyone else in the room. Marcus wouldn't think about it again until the night everything else fell apart, and Renata Ford's trust in a filing habit she'd never had to question turned out to be the one thing standing between 400 people and a much worse story than the one they ended up in. The morning it started, Marcus was in the northeast stairwell with a manometer, checking stair pressurization. The system that, in a real fire, pumps outside air into the stairwell fast enough to keep smoke out of the one path 400 people would use to get down 42 floors alive. Code required a minimum pressure differential of 0.05 inches of water column with the stair doors closed. His gauge read 0.02. He checked it twice, then a third time, moving the gauge to 2 other landings, because a number that wrong deserved to be wrong on purpose before he believed it. It held steady at 0.02 on every floor he tested. He opened the electrical panel behind the fan controller and found what he'd half expected and fully dreaded, a manual bypass switch, wired in after the fact, cheap and fast. The kind of thing an electrical sub installs at 11 at night when a general contractor tells him the pressurization test has to pass by Thursday or the whole schedule slips. Flip the switch, the fans run at full output for exactly as long as the test takes. Flip it back, they throttle down to whatever keeps the building's energy bill low. In an actual fire, with the bypass in its normal position, the stairwell wouldn't hold pressure. Smoke would. Before he did anything else, before he called his site supervisor, before he called Colby Vance's construction manager, Marcus opened his laptop and uploaded that morning's field log to the city fire marshal's inspection portal. He did this every single day, first thing, coffee still in the cup holder. It wasn't required until final submission. It was just how he'd always worked. The same way his father had never left a scene without writing down what he'd found. Nobody on site ever asked him about it. It looked, to anyone watching, like paperwork. He found the electrician who'd installed the bypass an hour later, a wiry man named Cesar Munoz, who didn't try to lie about it once Marcus laid the wiring diagram in front of him. Dale told me Thursday's test had to pass, Cesar said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. Said if it didn't, it was coming out of my invoice, not his. I got 4 kids and a payment on a truck. I did what I was told to do to keep the check coming. I'm not here to burn you, Cesar. I need this bypass pulled and the fans retested at true code minimum before Saturday. Can you do that in 3 days? I can do it in 1, if somebody tells me I'm allowed to. Cesar looked at him then, steady. You gonna be the one who tells me that? I'm going to try, Marcus said, and meant it, and didn't yet know how much that sentence was going to cost him. The construction manager, a heavyset man named Dale Ostroff who'd run bigger towers than this one, listened to Marcus for exactly 90 seconds before his jaw set. You're telling me a bypass switch is going to blow our opening. I'm telling you the stairwell doesn't pressurize to code, Marcus said. The bypass is how somebody made the test pass without fixing that. I already talked to Cesar. He can pull it and retest in a day if you authorize it. The gala's in 6 days, Marcus, 400 people. Press, half the investment committee for the REIT rollout is flying in. You understand what that date means to this project? I understand what .02 inches of water column means to the 400 people trying to get down a smoke-filled stairwell, Marcus said. I can't sign the occupancy cert until it's fixed and retested. That's not a negotiation, Dale. That's the license. Dale didn't answer that directly. He said he'd loop in Colby's office. He said it the way men say things when they've already decided whose side they're going to be on before the meeting even happens. Richard Colby's office occupied the northwest corner of the 40th floor, and it had the particular coldness that expensive rooms sometimes have. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A desk clear enough to land a plane on. A single orchid that Marcus suspected got replaced weekly rather than watered, because nothing in that room looked like it had been allowed to age. Colby was 58, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well, wearing a watch Marcus guessed cost more than his truck. He'd built Colby Vance Development from a single strip mall in Murfreesboro 30 years ago, a fact he mentioned in nearly every interview, usually right before mentioning that nobody had ever handed him anything. What he mentioned less often, though it was public record if anyone bothered to look, was that his own father had run a small lumber operation outside Cookeville that the bank had called in without warning the year Colby turned 16, on the grounds, never fully explained to the family, that the business had suddenly become a poor risk. Colby had spent 30 years building things too large and too visible for any bank or board or city to ever make that same unilateral call on him again. It didn't make the way he ran a room excusable. It made it explicable, which was a different thing, and the only thing that ever really is. Marcus Webb. Colby said it like he was trying the name on. Dale tells me you've found something. Marcus laid it out plainly. The pressure reading, the bypass switch, the fix, which wasn't complicated, pull the illegal wiring retest, 3 days, maybe 4. Colby listened with his hands folded, nodding at intervals that felt performed rather than absorbed. Here's what I need you to understand, Colby said, when Marcus finished. This building has $400 million of investor confidence riding on Saturday night, going perfectly. I need someone who actually understands what that means, not someone reading me numbers off a checklist. Marcus kept his voice level. I wrote the checklist. Misty, Colby. I'm the engineer of record. I've certified every life safety system in this building for a year and a half. I know what you are. Colby smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. I'm asking you to work with me on timing. There it was, small and precise as a splinter. I know what you are. Delivered like a man explaining something to a subcontractor's assistant who'd wandered into the wrong meeting, not to the licensed engineer whose signature the entire building's occupancy depended on. Colby's watch caught the light when he gestured. Marcus's boots still had drywall dust on them from the stairwell. Neither man mentioned the gap between those two facts. Neither man needed to. I'll work with you on timing, Marcus said. 3 days gets it fixed before your gala, and Cesar's already told me he can move faster than that if he's authorized today. I can't work with you on the code minimum. That number doesn't move, and it wasn't set by me. It was set by people who've buried firefighters over buildings that skipped it. Something flickered across Colby's face, not remorse. Marcus would think later, more like irritation at being reminded the world had rules that predated his schedule. Get me a timeline that doesn't touch Saturday, Colby said, and we'll talk about the rest. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't refusal either. It was the sound of a man buying himself room to find another answer. That night, Angela found him at the kitchen table with his father's notebook open, not writing anything, just turning it over in his hands. They're going to push back, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd watched him lose fights like this before, quieter ones, smaller buildings. They already are. Marcus rubbed his eyes. $180,000, Ange. That's Jasmine full-time. That's the fourth hire. That's the office lease we talked about. And if you sign it anyway? .02 instead of .05. Then, it's my signature on a stairwell that might not hold smoke back in a real fire. I've seen what that looks like from the other side, Ange. I watched them lower my father into the ground, because a number like that got signed off by somebody who didn't want to lose a contract. He closed the notebook, set his hand flat on the cover. I'm not doing that. Not for $180,000, not for $400,000, not for anything. I know, Angela said, and she didn't say it like a consolation. She said it like a fact she was proud of. I just need you to know what it might cost, and I need you to know I'm not scared of it costing that. She'd come home from a shift 2 nights before still smelling faintly of smoke that wasn't hers. A duplex fire on the north side. 2 kids pulled out by a neighbor before the department even arrived. Both of them fine. Both of them going to be fine. And Angela had sat in the driveway for 10 minutes afterward, before she could make herself walk inside their own house. She didn't tell Marcus that story to guilt him into anything. She told him because it was true, and because in 14 years of marriage to a man who read pressure gauges for a living, she'd learned that the numbers he cared about weren't abstractions to either of them. They were the difference between a bad night and the worst night of someone's life, multiplied by however many people happened to be standing in the wrong stairwell when it mattered. Malik chose that exact moment to come downstairs for his 4th meal of the evening, 15 years old and growing out of his shoes every few months. Already taller than Marcus by an inch and still not used to it, walking into rooms like he wasn't sure yet where his own elbows ended. He caught the tail end of the conversation's tone, if not its words. The particular quiet that meant his parents were talking about something that mattered, and asked halfway into the refrigerator whether everything was okay with the big building. It's a lot of moving pieces, Marcus said, which was true and also nothing, the exact ratio a father learns to aim for with a 15-year-old who's old enough to worry and too young to carry the whole weight of the worry yet. You always say that. Malik didn't push further. He just sat down with a plate stacked higher than the plate probably should have held, and some things you don't say in front of your kid even when he's old enough to understand them. Marcus and Angela let the conversation fold itself back into normal dinner table noise. Later, after Malik had gone back up, Angela told him what she saw in the ER most weeks that nobody put on the news. Smoke inhalation. Crush injuries. The specific quiet of families waiting on news that wasn't going to be good. You're not being dramatic, she said. You're being the reason it doesn't happen to 400 people you'll never meet. Jasmine caught up with Marcus in the Ridgeline's parking garage 2 mornings later, jogging to match his pace, a printout in her hand. You need to see this. She held it up. It was a life safety summary. His summary, his logo, his findings, except the language had been softened. Deficiency noted, remediation scheduled had become minor calibration variants, monitored. His name was still on it. His actual words weren't. Where'd you get this? Meridian Compliance sent it to the city portal an hour ago. Out-of-state firm. Some outfit Colby's people found, who does rush inspections for developers in a hurry. I called their office pretending I needed to confirm a site visit time. Marcus. Nobody there could tell me when they walked the northeast stair. I don't think they ever did. I think they just rewrote yours and put a new letterhead on it. Marcus stood very still in the gray light of the parking garage, holding a piece of paper with his own name attached to words he had never written, describing a danger as a footnote. They can't submit that, he said. That's not their finding. It's not even accurate to mine. I know. I already told my mom I might be looking for a third part-time gig again by next month. I didn't know if you knew, and I didn't know if telling you was going to make things worse for you or better. Her voice caught slightly on the last part. He looked at her, 24 years old, 3 jobs deep, trying to become what she already was, standing in a garage telling the truth to a man who might not have a firm to hire her into by Friday. "Thank you for bringing me this," he said. "And Jasmine, whatever happens this week, that wasn't your call to make. It was mine. Keep your head down and keep doing good work. That's the only thing that's ever protected either of us." She didn't look reassured. She was smart enough not to be. 3 days before the gala, Colby brought a delegation of investment committee members through the building for a preview walkthrough. 6 men and 2 women in business casual, touring the podium retail space and the sample condo units, while a Colby Vance marketing associate narrated square footage and finish packages. Marcus was on the 31st floor when they passed through, kneeling beside an open panel with his manometer, and one of the investors, a man in his 60s with a Patek Philippe catching the hallway light, stopped to ask the marketing associate whether the maintenance guy needed them to clear the hallway. "He's the engineer of record," the associate said, a little too quickly, a little embarrassed on Marcus's behalf. "He's the one who signs off on the building being safe to occupy." "Huh," the investor said, and looked at Marcus for exactly as long as it took to file that information away as mildly surprising, and then kept walking, already asking about the finish package on the penthouse floor. Marcus didn't look up from the gauge. He'd stopped expecting the correction to change anything in the room the moment it happened. What mattered was that the correction existed on the record at all, said out loud, by someone other than him. He wrote the reading in the notebook, Neuro 2, same as every other day that week, and moved to the next landing. Elena Brooks had been Colby Vance's chief operating officer for 6 years, and in that time, she had developed a very specific skill, knowing exactly how much to say in a room to keep her seat at the table without ever quite lying. She'd come up through project finance, not construction, and she'd told herself for most of those 6 years that the technical side of the business belonged to other people's consciences, not hers, that her job was the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet didn't have opinions about stairwell pressurization. It was a comfortable enough story to live inside, right up until the week it stopped being one. She found Marcus in the lobby that same afternoon, ostensibly to hand him a revised construction schedule. Actually to say something she'd clearly been rehearsing. "I flagged the budget on the stair fans back in the spring," she said, quiet enough that Dale, 20 feet away, couldn't hear it. "Told Richard we were cutting the commissioning timeline too close. He said the schedule was the schedule." She looked at the printout in Marcus's hand. He was still carrying Meridian's altered summary, and something crossed her face that looked almost like relief that someone else had finally said the thing out loud. "I'm not telling you to fight this. I'm telling you I already know you're right, and I don't know what I'm going to do about that yet." "You could tell the city what you just told me," Marcus said. "I could," Elena said, and didn't promise she would, and walked away before the conversation could ask more of her than she was ready to give. The Meridian engineer showed up on site the next morning. A man named Todd Kessler, whom Marcus had never met before, and who introduced himself with the breezy confidence of someone who'd clearly been told this would be an easy job. He was carrying a tablet, not a manometer. "Heard you've been thorough on this one," Kessler said, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes, the way people avoid eye contact with someone they know they're about to inconvenience. "I'm just doing a confirmatory pass. Shouldn't take long." "You planning to actually test the northeast stair pressurization?" Marcus asked, Or just confirm what Dale already told you to write down? Kessler's smile thinned. I'm sure it's fine. These bypass situations usually resolve themselves once the fans are back in normal mode. They don't resolve themselves. Somebody has to physically pull the wiring. I can show you exactly where it is, if you want to see it before you sign anything with my name quoted underneath yours. Kessler didn't take him up on it. He was gone from the site by lunch, and his firm's confirmatory pass appeared in the city portal that evening. 11 minutes of stated site time attached to a document that ran 4 pages. Marcus printed it and put it in the folder with everything else. He didn't need to prove Kessler hadn't done the work. He just needed the file to exist for whoever eventually asked. Marcus spent that evening at his kitchen table with a second engineer he trusted, an old classmate named Priya Rao, who ran her own small commissioning firm across town, walking her through the numbers over the phone just to make sure he wasn't missing something. Wasn't being stubborn out of pride instead of code. She ran the calculation herself, twice, and came back with the same number he already had. "You're not wrong, Marcus," she said. "You know that. I know I'm not wrong. I'm asking if I'm being unreasonable." Being right and being unreasonable aren't the same thing, and they're going to try to convince you they are. Don't let them. A pause. "You thinking about your dad?" "Every day this week." "Then you already know what you're going to do." The confrontation, when it came, happened in Colby's 40th floor office again, this time with Dale Ostroff and Elena Brooks present, 4 days before the gala. "You had someone alter my report," Marcus said. No preamble. He set the printout on Colby's glass desk. Colby didn't flinch. "I had someone give me options. You gave me a problem with no timeline that worked. I gave you a 3-day fix, authorized 4 days ago, and still not started. You gave the city a lie with my name attached to it. Your name's not on the submission line, Marcus. Meridian's is. My findings are quoted in it. Word for word, except the words that mattered." Marcus kept his voice flat, kept his hands still. "I won't sign the certificate of occupancy until the stair pressurization system passes at code minimum. That hasn't changed since Monday, and it's not going to change by Saturday." Colby leaned back. Something in his face shifted, not anger exactly, something closer to a man recalculating. "I need someone who really understands these systems," he said. "Not someone working off a checklist he's terrified to deviate from." The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has heard something they're not going to say out loud. Elena Brooks looked at her hands. Dale looked at the window. "I wrote the checklist," Marcus said again, evenly, because it was still true, and it was the only thing left to say. "I've been the engineer of record on this building for 18 months. I understand exactly what I'm looking at. That's the problem for you, not the solution." "You know what I hear when you talk," Colby said, "is somebody who's never actually had to make a decision that costs real money. You run a small shop. What? 3 people? 4? I've got investors who fly in from 3 time zones for Saturday night. You're not the one who has to look them in the eye if this slips. I looked a lot of people in the eye at my father's funeral because a building he walked into passed an inspection it shouldn't have," Marcus said. "I'd rather look your investors in the eye and tell them their opening's delayed 4 days than look anybody in the eye after the alternative. That's not inexperience, Richard. That's the only experience that actually matters here." Colby's jaw tightened, and for a moment Marcus thought something in the room might actually shift. It didn't. Cesar's crew can finish the rewiring by Thursday night if Dale releases the change order today, Marcus added. The retest takes 4 hours. You'd still have Friday to walk the building before the gala. I'm not asking you to cancel Saturday, Richard. I'm asking you to give me one more day. Colby looked at Dale. Dale said nothing. It was, in its own way, an answer. Get me a report that doesn't put this project a week behind, Colby said. Or get off my project. There isn't one, Marcus said. There's a report that tells the truth, and there's Meridian's, and you already know which one you're planning to file. 2 days before the gala, Marcus arrived for the final walkthrough with the certificate of occupancy sign-off sheet in his bag, unsigned, and a copy of his original findings for the record. Cesar's crew had not been released to start the rewiring. The bypass switch was still in the panel behind the northeast stair fan controller, exactly where it had been the first morning Marcus found it. The meeting was larger than the ones before it. Dale, Elena, 2 junior Colby Vance staffers, and Colby himself, standing at the head of the same glass table, in front of a rendering of Saturday's gala floor plan projected on the wall behind him. I'm not signing the occupancy certificate, Marcus said, plainly, in front of all of them. The stairwell doesn't meet code. It hasn't been fixed. I've given you 4 days to authorize a 1-day repair, and it's still sitting exactly where I found it. You're not the only engineer in this state, Marcus, Colby said. I'm the only one who's actually inspected this building for 18 months and can tell a court I did it honestly, Marcus said. You can find someone else to sign it. That doesn't make the stairwell hold pressure. It just means the next person's name is on the mistake instead of mine. Colby's voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. Then, we're done here. Dale, get someone from Meridian on the phone today. Marcus, I'll have security walk you to your truck. Turn in your badge on the way out. Elena Brooks didn't say anything. She would think about that silence for a long time afterward. Marcus picked up his hard hat, his laptop, and the notebook, and he left the way he'd learned to leave rooms like that one. Spine straight, voice level, giving them nothing to point to later. Security walked him to his truck without touching him, which he was grateful for, because he wasn't entirely sure in that moment that he could have kept his composure if a hand had landed on his arm. Jasmine caught him at the loading dock elevator before the doors closed, out of breath. Having sprinted down from the 31st floor, the second word reached her. They can't do this, she said. You're the engineer of record. They can't just... They can end the contract, Marcus said, gently. Because she was 24 and this was the first time she'd watched integrity cost someone something real, and he remembered what that first time felt like. They can't erase what I found. That part's already out of their hands. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder. I need you to stay on through Saturday if you can stand it. Not for them. For everybody walking through that lobby who doesn't know what's in that stairwell. Somebody who actually understands the system needs to be inside that building tomorrow night. It's not going to be me. That's not fair to you. No. Marcus agreed. It isn't. Doesn't change what needs to happen. She hugged him once, quick and fierce. The kind of hug you give somebody when you don't have better words available yet, and went back upstairs to keep working for a firm that had just proven it would gut his findings the moment it was inconvenient not to. Marcus watched the elevator doors close behind her and thought, not for the first time that week, that the hardest part of doing the right thing was never the doing. It was watching the people who believed in you pay a little bit of the price, too. He sat in his truck in the Ridgeline's loading dock for 11 minutes before he could make himself turn the key. His hard hat was on the passenger seat. The notebook was in his lap, closed, his thumb resting on the worn corner where his father's initials had faded to almost nothing. He called Angela. She was between patients, could only talk for a minute, and what she said in that minute was the only thing that mattered. You didn't do anything wrong. You did the one thing you were hired to do. He didn't fully believe her yet. He would, later. Right now, he mostly felt $180,000 evaporating, and a fourth hire that wasn't going to happen, and a 19-year-old promise. He'd apparently just honored his way out of the only project big enough to matter. Jasmine texted him twice in the next hour. The first message asked if he was okay. The second, 20 minutes later, said she'd been told to keep working under Meridian's supervision through Saturday if she wanted to keep getting paid, and asked what she should do. Stay, he wrote back. Keep your eyes open. Don't sign anything. Text me if anything changes. He almost added I'm sorry, and then didn't, because he wasn't sorry for the decision, only for what it had cost the 24-year-old who'd trusted him to be right about it. He didn't know, sitting there, that his morning upload, the routine one, the coffee in the cup holder one, filed at 8:14 that day exactly like every other day, for 18 months, had already reached a fire marshal's desk. It sat in a queue behind 11 other routine filings, tagged automatically by the portal software for the single flagged line item, stairwell pressurization deficiency, life safety. Unresolved. Nobody had read it yet. But it was there. Timestamped, filed by a licensed engineer, hours before anyone terminated him, which meant that whatever happened next, nobody could credibly call it something he'd cooked up out of spite on his way out the door. He just drove home, and that night he sat with Angela and Malik and didn't talk much, and Angela didn't push him to, and around 10 he finally opened the notebook and wrote one line in it. The only line he wrote that whole week. Told them. They didn't listen, filed it anyway. Some things you do because they're right, not because they work. The next morning, Angela made Marcus call an employment attorney a colleague had recommended months earlier, half joking at the time, for a different, smaller dispute that had never materialized. The attorney, a measured woman named Renee Okafor, who specialized in retaliation claims, listened to the whole sequence of events without interrupting once, then told him plainly what his options were. He could pursue a retaliation claim against Colby Vance for terminating a life safety contract in direct response to a properly filed regulatory disclosure, which the timestamp on his city filing would make considerably easier to prove than most cases she saw. She also told him something he hadn't fully considered, that as the engineer of record, his professional obligations to the public didn't end just because his contract had, and that continuing to cooperate fully and visibly with the city's process, rather than going quiet out of hurt or exhaustion, would matter both for the case and for what happened to the building itself. You didn't do anything wrong, Okafor said, echoing, almost word for word, what Angela had already told him in the loading dock parking lot. But being right isn't the same as being protected. Let's make sure you're both. Friday night, one day before the gala, Priya Rao called him with a suggestion he sat with for a long time before turning down. She had a contact at the Tennessean who covered commercial real estate, she said, one phone call, and Marcus could get the bypass switch and the altered report in front of a reporter before Saturday's champagne even chilled. It would embarrass Colby publicly, maybe even force a delay. I thought about it, Marcus admitted. I want you to know that. I thought about it hard. Why didn't you? Because it's not my finding to leak. It's the city's to act on. I filed it through the right channel the day I found it. If I go around that now just because I got fired, I'm not proving I was right anymore. I'm just proving I'm angry, and I might actually be right and angry, but only one of those things holds up in front of a licensing board. He turned the notebook over in his hand as he said it, the same instinct his father had carried into every scene he ever wrote up. Do it the way that still means something afterward. Renata Ford has my report. If Colby doesn't fix it, that's not my failure to correct anymore. It's hers to act on, and his to answer for. Priya didn't argue with him. She just said, quietly, that she hoped he was right to trust the system that much, and Marcus told her he wasn't trusting the system, he was trusting the paperwork, which was a different thing entirely, and the only thing he'd ever really controlled. Saturday afternoon, 6 hours before doors opened, Richard Colby walked the lobby floor with the events coordinator, checking sightlines for the step and repeat, where photographers would catch investors on their way in. He asked, once, in passing, whether the engineer situation was fully closed out. Dale told him Meridian's paperwork was filed, and the certificate was in hand. Colby didn't ask which stairwell had been retested, or whether it had been retested at all. He'd already decided. The way men in his position often decide, that a closed file and a solved problem were the same thing as long as nobody made him look at the difference. He checked his watch, told the coordinator the flowers on table 12 needed to come up half an inch, and moved on to the next thing that could actually go wrong on camera. Saturday night, the Ridgeline's lobby held 400 people in a room built to make them feel like the future had already arrived. String quartet in the corner. A wall of Nashville press photographing investors under a ceiling 3 stories tall. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of things Marcus couldn't have named. Richard Colby worked the room in a tuxedo, telling a version of the last 6 days that didn't include a fired engineer or a bypassed stair fan, and mostly, people believed him. Because believing him was easier, and the champagne was very good. Elena Brooks stood near the edge of the room, not drinking, watching the crowd with the specific unease of someone who has spent a week being quietly complicit and is starting to understand what that word actually costs. She'd told herself, driving in that evening, that the building had been signed off by a licensed engineer, technically true, and that this made her clean, technically false. And some part of her already knew the difference. Jasmine Reeves was there too. Technically still on Colby Vance's approved vendor list through Meridian's paperwork. Technically not supposed to be running anything, watching the stairwell doors from across the atrium because Marcus had asked her, before he left, to keep an eye on that one system, just in case, and because she trusted him more than she trusted anyone currently holding a champagne flute. At 8:47 p.m., 17 minutes after Marcus Webb's truck had cleared the Ridgeline's parking garage exit for what he'd assumed was the last time, a section of that same illegal bypass wiring, still live, still doing exactly what it had been installed to do, arced inside the northeast stairwell's electrical panel. It wasn't a large fire. It didn't need to be. What it needed to do was fill a stairwell with smoke, and because that stairwell was pressurizing at 0.02 inches of water column instead of the 0.05 the code required, that's exactly what it did. The first alarm went off at 8:49. By 8:51, every alarm in the building had followed. Jasmine smelled it before the alarms confirmed it. That specific, acrid, electrical smell, wrong in a room full of perfume and hors d'oeuvres, and she was already moving toward the northeast stair when the panel sounded. She called Marcus from the stairwell landing, coughing once, hand over her mouth. "It's the stair. It's filling. You were right. You were completely right. I need you back here." He hadn't gone far. He'd stopped at a gas station 4 blocks away, still sitting in the lot, still not quite able to make himself drive the rest of the way home, replaying the meeting in his head, and wondering how many more ways he could have said the same number before someone believed it. When Jasmine's call came in, he didn't hesitate for even a second before turning the truck around. He was back inside the Ridgeline's lobby in 6 minutes. Badge revoked. Security waved him through anyway because the man at the door remembered exactly whose name had been on every inspection tag in that building for 18 months and exactly whose name had just stopped being on them. Inside, it was controlled panic. 400 people in formal wear being funneled toward exits by staff who hadn't drilled for this, smoke curling visibly at the top of the northeast stairwell door, a second stair holding. Barely, because it hadn't been touched by the bypass. Marcus didn't look for Colby. He looked for the stair doors, found the working one, and started directing people toward it with the calm, specific authority of a man who had memorized this building's bones for a year and a half. That door. Not this one. That door. Go. Keep moving. Don't stop on the landings, ma'am. Leave the bag. Go. That's it. Keep moving. An elderly investor in a wheelchair had been left stranded near the smoke-filling stair by a server who'd panicked and moved with the crowd instead of stopping. Marcus and a hotel security guard carried him, chair and all, down 2 flights to the working stair, Marcus's tuxedo-clad shoulder taking most of the weight the whole way, because it was faster than waiting for an elevator nobody should have been using anyway. Jasmine had positioned herself at the 4th floor landing of the working stair, phone flashlight up, physically blocking the door to the smoke-filling stairwell, so panicked guests wouldn't default to the nearer exit out of habit. Not that one, she said over and over to person after person, some of them the same investors who'd been introduced to her an hour earlier as the young lady helping with the systems, a phrase that had made her wince at the time and meant nothing to her now. This one. Down, not up. Keep your hand on the rail. Smoke had begun to press under the northeast stair door in a thin gray sheet by the time the last stragglers cleared the lobby. A caterer's assistant who'd gone back for a tray of chef's knives out of some instinct toward the job that made no sense under the circumstances. A young associate from the investment bank who'd frozen at the sight of the smoke until Marcus physically turned her by the shoulder and pointed her toward the working stair. 200 feet away, a member of the string quartet was still holding her cello case against her chest like a shield, unsure whether the instrument counted as something worth going back for. It didn't, and someone told her so, and she left it. Nashville Fire arrived at 8:58. The fire marshal on duty, a woman named Renata Ford, who Marcus had worked with on 2 prior projects, found him at the base of the working stairwell, still directing traffic, tuxedo-clad investors and kitchen staff alike, moving past him in a steady stream. "Webb," she said, breathing hard from the stairs. "Tell me what I'm walking into." Northeast stair, electrical panel behind the pressurization fan controller. There's a bypass switch that shouldn't exist. It's been there since before commissioning. Fans are throttled below code minimum in normal operation. That's why the stair's not holding pressure. Ford's radio was already up. "Copy. We've got your filing from this morning. Priority flagged 8:14 a.m. Stairwell pressurization deficiency. Why isn't this fixed?" And that was the moment Richard Colby, moving through the evacuating crowd toward whatever version of control he still thought he had, heard a fire marshal say those words in front of 24 witnesses, several of them holding phones, one of them a reporter from the Tennessean, who'd come to cover a ribbon cutting, and was now covering something considerably more interesting. "I don't know what filing you're referring to," Colby said. "Your engineers," Ford said, flat, already moving past him toward the stair. "Filed this morning, 8:14 a.m. It's been sitting in our queue since before your gala started." Colby turned to Marcus, and for one unguarded second, something in his face wasn't calculation anymore. It was closer to fear. "You did this on your way out." "I filed it before you fired me, Richard." Marcus's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Every morning for a year and a half. Today wasn't different. You were." A small crowd had gathered without quite meaning to. Elena Brooks, close enough to hear every word. Jasmine still coughing lightly from the stairwell smoke. The reporter with her phone very obviously recording. Dale Ostroff standing off to the side with the specific stillness of a man watching his own name get attached to a decision he didn't make, but didn't stop either. "This is a coordinated smear," Colby said to Ford, to the reporter, to whoever would still listen. "This man was terminated for cause, and now he's staging a a narrative around a routine electrical incident. "There's nothing routine about a stairwell that doesn't meet fire code, Mr. Colby," Ford said, "and I don't stage anything. I read timestamps." She held up her radio like it was evidence, which, functionally, it was. 8:14 a.m. yesterday. Before your termination letter, according to your own HR system, went out at 11:40. You want to explain that order of operations to the DA's office, or should I let them ask you themselves? "Where's the compliance report Meridian filed?" Ford asked. "The one that says minor calibration variance, monitored?" "That's the one I told you about," Jasmine said, before anyone could stop her, holding up her phone with the altered summary still pulled up from the day she'd shown Marcus in the parking garage. "It quotes his findings and changes the conclusion. He never wrote that language. I can show you the original." Ford looked at Colby for a long moment. "You're going to want a lawyer before you say anything else tonight, Mr. Colby." "You had $400 million riding on Saturday going perfectly," Marcus said to Colby, quiet enough that it wasn't for the crowd, even though the crowd heard it anyway. "I had 400 people riding on that stairwell holding pressure. I told you which one I was going to protect. You should have believed me the first time. Now the city's going to make you understand it." He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need the crowd, didn't perform for the phone. It was, Elena would say later, the calmest sentence she'd ever heard delivered in the middle of an emergency, and it was the one that ended up in every article written about that night. Angela heard about it before Marcus called her, the way ER nurses in a city that size often hear about things. A colleague texting the group chat that Vanderbilt was on standby for a possible mass casualty transfer from downtown. A high-rise, smoke inhalation, unclear numbers. She'd stood in the break room reading that message with her stomach in her throat for the 4 minutes it took Marcus to call her back. And when he finally did, breathless, telling her everyone was out, everyone was safe, she'd had to sit down on an overturned supply crate before her legs would hold her. "I need you to say that again," she told him. "Slower." "Everybody's out, Ange. Nobody died. I got there in time. It's over." She didn't cry until she got home 11 hours later, after her shift ended, after she'd spent the whole night treating other people's emergencies with the specific focus that comes from needing somewhere to put your hands, while your mind is still 4 blocks away in a stairwell. Marcus was asleep on the couch when she walked in, still in his ruined tuxedo shirt, the notebook open on his chest to the page with one line written in it from 3 nights before. She didn't wake him. She just sat down next to him and stayed there a while, listening to him breathe. The consequences arrived quickly, and mostly without drama, the way real consequences usually do. Nashville Fire red-tagged the ridgeline that night. The certificate of occupancy Colby had been racing toward was pulled before the smoke had fully cleared from the northeast stair. 6 guests were treated for minor smoke inhalation, 1 for a sprained ankle sustained in the crowded stairwell. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously hurt, which everyone involved understood, in the days that followed, had far more to do with Jasmine's early warning and Marcus's return than with anything Colby Vance Development had built into the tower on purpose. The Tennessean ran its first story 2 days later under the headline, "Engineer Fired for Safety Warning Was Right. City Confirms Report Filed Hours Before Termination." The reporter who'd been at the gala had pulled the timestamp on Marcus's filing directly from the fire marshal's office and laid the whole sequence out in plain, unadorned language: the warning, the termination, the 17 minutes, the alarms. 3 other outlets picked it up within the week. Marcus gave exactly 1 interview, kept it short, declined to characterize Colby's motives beyond what the record already showed, and spent most of the 5 minutes talking about stair pressurization requirements in a tone so calm and technical that the reporter later told him it had been the most understated interview she'd ever conducted with someone who'd just been vindicated on camera. He didn't do it for the coverage. He did it because Cesar Munoz had asked him to, quietly, worried that without someone explaining the wiring clearly, the story would end up being about a fired black engineer and a lucky guess instead of about a system that had been deliberately defeated to hit a deadline. The State Board of Licensing Examiners for Engineers opened an inquiry within the week into Meridian Compliance Group's altered submission and into whether Meridian had even physically inspected the stairwell it certified. Meridian's principal engineer surrendered his license rather than contest the findings, after phone records showed his site visit log for the Ridgeline consisted of a single 11-minute stop at the loading dock. The fire marshal's office referred the falsified filing to the district attorney's office for review. By autumn, Colby Vance Development was facing a criminal negligence investigation and a stack of civil suits from injured guests and displaced tenants whose move-in dates evaporated overnight, along with a fraud claim tied to the falsified compliance filing itself. Colby Vance's board of directors, watching their stock and their reputation both go into freefall on the same news cycle, forced Richard Colby's resignation 11 days after the gala. He did not go quietly, and he did not go with anything resembling an apology. The closest he came, in a deposition made public months later, was a single line. "Nobody hands you a tower, you protect it any way you can." That read, to everyone who saw it, less like an excuse than a confession. Elena Brooks cooperated fully with the investigation, testified to what she'd known and when she'd known it, including the spring budget conversation she'd had with Colby about the fan commissioning timeline, and resigned her position the same week rather than wait to be asked. It cost her the stock options that would have vested at year's end. She told a reporter, when asked why, that she'd spent 1 week being the kind of executive who stays quiet to keep her seat at the table, and that 1 week had been enough. The Colby Vance board meeting that ended Richard Colby's tenure ran 40 minutes, according to 2 people who were in the room. Elena's testimony to investigators had already been leaked to 3 of the 7 board members by the time it started. Colby reportedly opened by calling the whole matter a communications failure. He closed 40 minutes later, having signed a resignation letter his own lawyer had drafted that morning, under a non-compete clause that would keep his name off a Nashville building permit for the next 5 years. The board's public statement used the word regret twice, and the word accountability once. Nobody who'd stood in that stairwell found either word particularly satisfying, but the outcome underneath them was real enough. Dale Ostroff kept his job at a different firm and kept telling anyone who'd listen that he'd only been following instructions, a defense that satisfied nobody, least of all Cesar Munoz, who testified, without being asked twice, exactly who had told him the bypass had to hold through Thursday's test. Cesar had been afraid, going into his interview with investigators, that admitting he'd installed the bypass would end his own license and his own 4 kids' grocery budget along with it. It didn't. The investigators' report named the pressure Dale had put on him explicitly, and a whistleblower protection provision in the state's contractor licensing code, one Cesar hadn't known existed until Marcus's lawyer walked him through it, kept his license intact. He sent Marcus a text a month later that just said, "Still got my license. Still got my kid's truck payment covered. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." Marcus kept that text. He didn't write it in the notebook. Some things didn't need the paper to be real. 8 months later, Webb Life Safety Consulting operated out of a real office for the first time, a modest second-floor suite off Charlotte Avenue, 4 desks instead of a kitchen table, and a laptop bag. Jasmine Reeves had her name on the door now, junior partner, the 4th hire finally made real, not by the Ridgeline contract, but by the 6 new ones that came after it. Developers across Nashville suddenly very interested in hiring the firm whose engineer had been right when it mattered. The city itself brought Webb Life Safety Consulting on as an independent auditor for post-incident life safety reviews across a dozen high-rises that had rushed occupancy in the building boom of the last 3 years. It wasn't glamorous work. It was exactly the work Marcus had always wanted to be doing, the kind that happened before anyone had to find out the hard way. He started a small mentorship fund that fall, seeded with part of the settlement money the city eventually pushed his firm's way for wrongful termination and retaliation, named for a Nashville firefighter most people had never heard of, the Elijah Webb Scholarship. $3,000 a year, awarded through a partnership with the local chapter of the National Society of Black Engineers to a first-generation engineering student who needed it to stay in school past the semester the money usually runs out. The first recipient was a 19-year-old sophomore from Antioch named Destiny Carr, studying mechanical engineering at Tennessee State on a financial aid package that had come up $900 short of covering spring semester. Marcus handed her the check himself in the new office, with Jasmine and Angela and Malik standing off to the side, and Destiny read the scholarship's name off the certificate and asked, hesitant, whether Elijah Webb was somebody in his family. "My father," Marcus said. "Firefighter, 22 years, here in Nashville. He died on a call because somebody signed off on a system that wasn't actually safe, to save a little time and a little money. I've spent my whole career trying to make sure that trade never gets made again on my watch." He didn't tell her the rest of it that day. The warehouse, the $4,000, the borrowed suit. Some of it he'd tell her eventually, the way you tell a story to someone once they're far enough along to carry it. That day, he just told her the scholarship was hers for as long as she stayed in the program. No strings, no essay required next year, just proof she was still standing in the field. She cried when he handed her the check, and he understood exactly why, because he'd been 19 once too, deciding what to do with a loss he hadn't chosen. In the spring, the State Board of Licensing Examiners for Engineers invited Marcus to speak at its annual continuing education conference, not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in what a properly maintained field record could accomplish when everything else in a project went wrong around it. He stood in front of 200 engineers, most of them strangers, and walked through the Ridgeline's timeline the same flat, technical way he'd walked Renata Ford through it the night of the gala. The pressure readings, the bypass switch, the filing timestamp, without once raising his voice or naming it a triumph. Afterward, an older engineer from Knoxville, gray-haired, easily 30 years into his own career, shook his hand and said he'd been keeping duplicate field logs himself since 1994, and had never once had anyone tell him it mattered until that morning. Marcus told him it had always mattered. It just hadn't always been visible. He gave Jasmine her own field notebook on her first day as partner, not his father's, a new one, but he wrote the same 2 lines inside the cover that had been written in his. Measure twice. Report twice. She kept it in her jacket pocket the way he'd taught her. And the first time a subcontractor asked her, condescending, whether she was sure she knew how to read a manometer, she didn't flinch. She'd been ready for that question longer than the man asking it knew, and she answered it with the reading, correct to 2 decimal places, and nothing else. Malik came by the new office sometimes after school, mostly for the vending machine at first, but he'd started asking Marcus real questions about pressure differentials and code minimums, the kind of questions that meant something was taking root. Marcus didn't push it. He just answered every time the way his own father had answered him, patient and specific, like the questions themselves mattered as much as the answers. On a Sunday that October, Marcus drove Angela and Malik past the old warehouse lot on the east side, the one that was a hotel parking structure now, and for the first time in 19 years, he didn't just slow down and keep going. He parked. He walked Malik to the corner of the lot where the loading dock used to be, and he told him, in full, for the first time, exactly what had happened there, and exactly why a spiral notebook with somebody else's initials on the cover had spent 2 decades riding around in his father's truck, and then his own. "I used to think keeping that promise cost me things," Marcus said. "The Ridgeline job, some nights of sleep, a little bit of being liked by people whose opinion I didn't actually need." He looked at his son, 15 years old, listening the way people only listen when they understand a thing is being handed to them on purpose. Turns out it never cost me anything I couldn't stand to lose. It just took a while to find that out. Angela slid her hand into his on the walk back to the truck. Neither of them said anything else about it. They didn't need to. Some men build towers to be remembered by. Marcus Webb had spent 19 years making sure the people inside them got to go home.